Very much, George. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Okay, I'm going to be the main speaker, today. Siewkee is here, of course. So I'm Pino Cutrone. It's nice to meet you. And my co-presenter is Siewkee Bay. We've done this research together. The title is Identifying and Overcoming Problems Associated with Remote Learning in Japanese Universities. Okay. So this slide is just an overview, of our presentation. Basically, we have 6 points that we want to cover. Okay, we're going to start off by talking about our situation, our teaching context, and we're going to talk about the background, what provided the impetus for us to study this topic, and the purpose, what are the aims of our studies. We'll present the research questions, and then we'll tell you, how we conducted our study by presenting the methodology. And then finally, what we found, our results and findings. And then we have a few recommendations and suggestions moving forward, for other teachers in our situation. And then, I hope we can have a Q&A session for about 5 or 10 minutes and a good discussion like we just had. Okay, so to talk about the situation in the Japanese EFL university context, within, what we both teach, Siewkee and I, we're both in that situation. Just to give you some information, Siewkee teaches, in Osaka, an urban, in Osaka, like an urban center at a small private university. Okay, and I teach in southern Japan, in Kyushu. I teach at a national university in, kind of like a mid-sized city, like of Nagasaki, sort of like, I would say, like a rural area, but the biggest part of the city in the rural area. So just to tell you, so when the pandemic hit, basically we were completely caught off guard, teachers and administration. Maybe it's very, obvious thing to say that school administrations and individual teachers, they all varied in how they dealt with the pandemic. But just to give you like a feel of what I felt is that, I teach, part-time at various universities. Some universities completely canceled classes for a month and a half. Some other universities had some classes, but they basically didn't really have a plan. They didn't know what was going on. It depended like a lot on what the teacher could do. And then when we talk about, teachers, there were some teachers that really couldn't like adapt, like especially right away. Like they were basically recording their lessons and, having staff put them online. And there were, some teachers that are quite good like at online teaching, and they've been doing it for a while, but there was just a huge, discrepancy as classes were all shifted online, where they were being canceled. So basically, there was just a lot of things going on, and there were more questions, than answers. The administration, they were also not sure what to do, like at the very beginning. Then as we went through the semester, teaching online, there wasn't really anybody monitoring, how things were going. So like it was hard to know what kind of feedback, students were giving. Basically, teachers were left to their own devices to kind of develop and like adapt on the fly. Okay, so we could talk more about that after, but it was not a good situation. Like I think like the hardest part is that we didn't know how much we should devote to it. We had this idea that the pandemic would soon be over and things would go back to normal. That's what like a lot of people were thinking. But here we are, over like a year later, and we're still in this situation, and no one knows when the end will be. But we have learned that there's value to online learning more than we ever thought. Okay, so on to like the next slide here. Talking about the background, we read various things, but there are 2 studies in particular that influenced our study that we're presenting here. So one is part 1 of this study that we're presenting is now part 2. Part 1, we looked at student responses. So that was like the need, is that we wanted to find out what students, thought of online learning and how things were going, try to, not only like improve it, for ourselves, but for our colleagues. So we asked students what they thought. Like in this particular presentation, we're talking about what teachers think. Okay, so we looked at what students thought before, and now what teachers think. And then we also we looked at Watson's study in a Thai EFL university context. Like in particular, Watson looked at teachers, and we used the same questionnaire that he developed. So that was influential in our research. Just to tell you briefly like about those two studies. In the one where we solicited students' perspective, we surveyed 346 Japanese EFL universities across 5 universities in different parts of Japan, wherever we could get like access to these students. They did an online questionnaire. Just to tell you some of the key findings, students basically had a very difficult time with online learning. They got better, but overall, they didn't really care for it like the majority. I mean, some of them did, but the majority, they thought it's just something that you do, only in an emergency situation. They definitely, like in this context, prefer face-to-face teaching, in-person teaching, and most of them wanted to be led by the teacher. So that's something we could talk about more. That has all sorts of, sidetrack things that we can get onto. Many students, they felt isolated and demotivated by the lack of interaction in online learning. So that was one of the reasons. I think somebody mentioned in the discussion that the first year students in particular, when they come, they, part of university life is to make friends and, to work in groups. And it's not just to, learn and to get the credit. So there's so many other aspects, and they actually depend on the classes to meet friends, like, and to talk to each other. So like if that's missing, they're missing like a big part, like of motivation in their learning. And then we, there's the fact that, synchronous methods were more well received than asynchronous methods. So that's something I should have mentioned earlier, is that like the teachers in classes were doing all sorts of different things and nobody was really keeping track of it. But some teachers, were teaching asynchronously, where they simply recorded lectures and just posted them, on a, learner management system. Some universities had their own, but some, they went to, Google Classroom, like, or something like that. And they would just post, videos, like, or materials. And that's what, like, a lot of teachers were doing. So there's not a lot of interaction. And then some teachers were using synchronous methods, such as what we're doing right now, like in real time, using like a video conferencing platform like Zoom. So basically, the more that it mimicked, face-to-face lessons, like in real time, probably the more students liked it, because that promoted more interaction. They still preferred, face-to-face over everything, but synchronous methods, generally were more well received. And I think not many teachers, like at least like around me, knew that like in the beginning for sure. So that was a kind of trial, like an error process. I mean, for me now, I teach all my lessons like on Zoom, but I started off kind of doing, half and half type of thing. Okay, so moving on to the next study, Watson study, Todd Watson, in a Thai EFL university context. So he surveyed 52 EFL teachers. So he did a kind of before and after study. So he surveyed them before, begin the first week when they started online teaching, and then he surveyed them again 5 weeks later. Okay, 4 or 5 weeks later. And basically he was looking to see, what problems, remained after they were able to get some experience. Okay. And so some of the problems that remained, had to do with Here, let me just check to make sure that the chats here are okay. Okay, whoops, sorry. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anyone talking to me. Okay, so he basically found that the problem that remained, had to do with time, teachers' time. Basically, teachers were working too hard. They were spending too much time checking like assignments. The teachers in this context, they were like, they said that they were spending too much time, communicating with students. And I'll mention later that I found something different in my context. But their students were contacting them like at all hours, and they were emailing them, and they just spent a lot more time than they usually do communicating with students. They had issues, time spent preparing stimulating activities to suit the online environment, the ability for students to understand content and the suitability of activities. So these were some of the problems that they identified. Okay. So now, moving on to our study. Okay, basically, like the aim, like of our study, was to follow what Watson did, but in our context, we wanted to identify, from a teacher's perspective, what were the problems that the teachers could identify. So, our first research question encompasses that. Okay, from a teacher's perspective, so what were the most serious problems associated with online instruction in our context or during the pandemic? And so we had 17, 17 items, Likert scale, basically following Watson's study, and then we had one open-ended question, and the open-ended question that at the end encompasses research question 2. How can teachers in this context best deal with serious problems associated with online instruction? So we want to identify the problems, and then we want the teachers to tell us how they got over them, and basically what they generally thought like of the online experience, how they could shed light to help other teachers improve. So to give you information, about how we conducted our study, okay, methodology. This is a very small scale study. We surveyed 30 Japanese EFL university teachers, of various ages and universities, like across Japan, 5 universities. We did a Google form questionnaire. I can show you at the end if anyone wants to see that. Okay, basically, there were some items used to collect some background information like on the teacher, and then there were 17 items following Watson's study on a Likert scale. His study, they had a range of 3, from 1 to 3. We wanted more of a range, so we measured from 1 to 7. Like, in another difference, Watson studied before and after, which is nice to do like a longitudinal design like that. We were only able to study it cross-sectionally. We asked students, we asked teachers, after they were done their first semester. So after teaching 1 semester, which is 4 months in Japan, so after teaching 1 semester online, that was when they did their questionnaire. Okay, so the participants were given an online questionnaire after 1 semester of online teaching. So basically, here's what we found. Okay, we used descriptive statistics. It didn't make sense to use inferential statistics with such a small sample size. So you could look here, basically anything, over 4 was deemed as somewhat, of a problem. If it was, under 4, then it was considered like a low priority problem. But if it was, between 4 and 5, we called that like a medium level problem, like a mid-level problem. And then if it was higher than 5, like the mean rating, like a teacher, if it was higher than 5, then we considered that like a high level problem, something that should be looked at. So you could see here, problem 1 and problem 8 were the highest. Okay, so time spent checking assignments and time spent preparing. So that's similar to what Todd Watson found, like in his study, like the teachers were basically spending like a lot more time doing that. Then, some of the medium level problems, problem two, okay, ironically, like different than what Watson found, time spent communicating with students was also found as a problem. But for us, for our study, from the open-ended question, the teacher thought they didn't spend enough time communicating with students. So this has all sorts of implications where, perhaps Thai EFL university students are more motivated, or they're, braver to talk to their teachers. Because in Japan, when you go online, especially if you're using asynchronous methods, you run the risk like of losing like the reticent students. They could all but disappear in this type of context. So you basically want to communicate, more, and you have to like initiate it like as a teacher. I'm sure those who are teaching in Japan, they can relate to what I'm saying. The suitability like of activities, like adapting it to an online like environment, that's problem three, as well as preparing stimulating activity, stimulating activities, like is problem six. That time spent teaching. Okay, so those were mid-level problems. And then, in the second slide that covers like the rest of the items, there weren't any any more high-level problem, but there were a few medium-level problems. So the clarity of methods, like an evaluation, trying to get the students to like understand, like, and to follow like the methods, like of, like of evaluation. That's something to be looked at, because well, as students submitting like assignments, to be able to get them to do that, like you have to monitor them like a lot more. Again, something that kept coming up is problem 15, issues with internet bandwidth. That was mentioned, and that was seen as a mid-level problem. Okay. Then, okay, I mentioned that at the end we had an open-ended question where teachers were giving their thoughts about, how to improve it and their general thoughts. Some common themes in the teacher responses. Okay, online was much more difficult than in-person lessons. Okay, so that goes without saying. But in fact, one teacher had a quote that I remember. He said that it would double the amount of preparation, but only half the value. So that was interesting. Like, I wonder how many teachers thought that. But I think that overall, when you look at the teachers, especially compared to like the students, the teachers, they seem to get not all teachers, there were still some, diehard holdovers who didn't really like online teaching, but the majority like of teachers, came to really like it and see some benefits, like, and some even, even preferred it. So that's quite different than what we found with the students, where the majority of them, really wanted to go back to face-to-face. So basically, there's a gap in what the teachers thought and what the students thought. And I think that would be like an area, to study more like in the future. But yes, teachers got better with time and experience, and so did students, to some degree. Synchronous lessons, like as I mentioned before, worked better than asynchronous lessons. It was just a better way to keep students engaged, like to ensure like attendance, like and monitor students, like etc. And then they reiterated that internet bandwidth issues occurred from time to time. So some suggestions, moving forward. First and foremost, two like objectives that have to be considered if we're going to be serious about online learning is for administrations. They have to make a concerted effort to provide teachers with continuing support and opportunities for development in this area. And there shouldn't have to be a global pandemic for them to initiate training, the training opportunities. And these opportunities should go well beyond just learning how to use Zoom or some other LMS or things like that. They basically should make that like a priority, where teachers are learning, innovative, like in modern ways of using the internet. Because I think if we've learned like anything is that we will need this, like even if there's not a pandemic, this has kind of changed how education will be going ahead, okay, moving forward. And teachers have to buy in. Like, and when I say that, I'm thinking like of, there were some teachers that basically just wanted to get it over with, and they were in survival mode, probably like all over the place. But that's just something that like would be lacking for students. Like if teachers weren't willing to buy in, like I mentioned before, some teachers just, cancel classes. Like there were courses, that were canceled because, teachers were unwilling to like adapt and things like that. Is that we need to, get teachers to, buy in fully. And we need like administrations to support them. If they're being overworked, they need to look at how much time is being spent on it. They need to plan, the schedules like accordingly, and they need to support them like and train them. So they have to work, hand in hand. So if you can get, those two things going, then you have a chance. But teachers have to develop on their own through trial and error. And in the off months, they can read, they can attend conferences, they can share, with their colleagues. There's a lot they can do, to explore different ways for self-development. So one thing that we would like to recommend is a flipped approach, where like a flipped approach is a mixed approach where you use synchronous lessons and asynchronous lessons together like in a course. So asynchronous lesson would involve maybe 15% like of the course, or sorry 20%, something like that, where it's basically homework where students are previewing course material like or course content, and they're preparing, they're getting familiar with the target language like or whatnot. And then when they move on to the other 80% of the course, which is done synchronously, they can actually practice, they can apply what they learn by communicating, they can engaging in interaction with their classmates and with the teacher, and they're doing projects and discussion like activities. So they can work together. It doesn't have to be completely on Zoom. Like ideally, like a mix of the two approach would probably be the most effective. Like at least that's what we found. Like, and that could be studied more for sure. Okay, it would also be wise to survey students at various points in an online course. So that's what provided like the impetus for our research, is that we wanted to know, what our students were thinking, how effective things were going, and how we could improve like upon ourselves. So I think that would be like important, is to ask students, how things are going, and not just one time, but throughout the course. And teachers have to adapt, okay, adapt on the go, and to deal with internet bandwidth issues that kept coming up. So basically, prepare and educate students to have the strongest internet connection possible. I mean, like a lot of students, they'll just turn on their computer, and the internet connection that they have, that's what they're going with. But if you get them thinking that, they should examine the place, before the class, like, and see if the connection like is strong. Just, I mean, like a lot of common sense stuff that students might not think of is, basically, tell them to turn everything off, like, all their applications, like to only use, what they're using like at that time, for the lesson. Basically that like a LAN cable connection, like is a much stronger connection than a wireless connection. And if you are going to use wireless, then 5G is better than 2G, those kinds of things. Also have a backup plan in place. If things are not working, one time I was in my class and, the internet connection was not working. So I just quickly, put the class like on my telephone, and, my telephone has an alternate, internet connection. Like, and I was able to save it, that time by having that plan like in place. So basically, if students consider having like a backup plan or a backup connection or a backup device, that's always good. And be ready to adjust and adapt on the fly. When I say like on the fly, I mean like when things happen, you just kind of go with it. So, if the, screen is freezing up, then you can ask people to turn off their camera. You can do things like that to save bandwidth. If it continues, then you just quickly contact them, like on the LMS that you're using, and you can work through it that way. But there's always a way to go around it, just by using a bit of ingenuity, in quick thinking. Okay, so basically that is the end of the presentation. We have 5 minutes for questions and answers and discussion. So I would love to hear from you. I will stop sharing the presentation and we are in the middle. Thank you for listening.
Everybody unmute for a second so we can give a round of applause for a great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep. Pino and Siewkee, pretty much everybody is in this room. And I don't know if you've seen the chat or not, but it's on fire. So you've really, identified something that people are quite passionate about. Ladies and gentlemen, my apologies. There's a limited time for questions, but if you have questions now would be a good time.
I'm curious to know if I may ask, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, Pino, your survey, was it voluntary and anonymous?
Yes, and yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that would certainly influence a lot. I think if you made students do it, yeah, definitely.
Because it always skews the results, right? When they're, yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
As I've said to a few people, I'm on sabbatical. I've been on sabbatical the past 10 months. So I was, I guess, spared a lot of what all of you went through, but my really close friends and colleagues who were struggling with this, I mean, the common complaint I heard, it was much complaint is the wrong word, but just how much extra time this took. And it felt like a lot of my friends were working double, triple, quadruple the amount of time they normally did. And not only not getting the same level of results, but not really being appreciated by the school for how much extra was required of them. And I think the stress level that teachers experienced this year was really something that is not reported about enough. And that's why I really hope that we can move from ERT to emergency remote teaching to proper online learning that's planned better and supported better and is less stressful and time consuming for teachers and students alike. I mean, I think that's a real issue, and it came up in your survey, and I was glad to see that.
Okay, thank you for that comment. I definitely, I can understand your points, and I definitely can see where you're coming from. I feel the exact same way. Thank you.
Charlie, you brought up a really good point, that there's very little discussion about teacher mental health throughout all of this. And for the first, I'm like a digital proselyte. I'm even a gadget hound, and I used to promote, digital learning in a blended learning environment. But I was really frustrated with the way my administration handled it across several universities. Number one being having no digital tool agency throughout all of this. For example, I like using Google tools, and I use them. I'm a Google certified trainer, and I use them to perfection. And my whole program was designed on how I could use those tools for collaboration and peer review and lots of engagement and stuff. And I was completely ripped away from me and said, nope, you got to use what's sanctioned by the university, which is Moodle. And I'm like, what's Moodle? And I'm like, overnight, I had to figure out, I can't even do half the things I want to do. And that just built on top of the stress of how do I do this now? I thought, I'm confident online digital stuff. Hey, I can handle it. And suddenly everything got flipped on me. I think that's a discussion that needs to be brokered on a national level about teacher tool agency, for starters.
Well, and this also connects with another one of your comments in the chat, which is an utter lack of teacher training in utilizing online tools. And that's something I've worked on for many years and continue to work on in terms of providing that teacher training as much as possible. But the other side of that is, a complete lack of knowledge of what teacher, online learning entails from the school side. I mean, we could see in February and March when we knew that this was coming, that there was probably a 2 to 3 month period, because a lot of schools sort of delayed until after Golden Week, and so there's about 2 or 3 months where they could have been preparing, where they could have been figuring out ways to utilize the tools, and they just pushed back and delayed without actually exploring or studying what they should have been doing. And so this was made much worse by the lack of understanding and lack of effort to prepare for this on the administrative side. So it's not only the lack of teacher training, but it's also sort of the schools not really adequately preparing for this either.
Sorry, go ahead,
Very
Vivian.
good point. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I believe Vivian has something to say.
Oh, I just wanted to add on to what Charles said. Thank you for your presentation, Pino.
Sorry, it's kind of
Yeah,
freezing.
that was great.
I just wanted to add on that what we often see in the situations that we're in right now is that the people making the decisions are not the people in the classroom. And that's exactly what happens with language policies and all that. You have these lawmakers making laws when they have no idea what's going on in the field. So really the frustration that has been seen this year is that even if we have those long faculty meetings and everyone is sharing their frustration, we know that in the end, even if the head of your department and all other departments are going to the president of the university and talking to the board, they are still going to say, oh, we're maintaining the level is this, we're not increasing that level, we're not going to do what you're asking, just do what the university says and follow the policies. And that's what's been frustrating, I think, in the end.
That's it. That was actually the point I was going to bring up. So thanks for saying that. I met a friend last summer. He's working at Stanford University. I believe it's Stanford. His job is he's an educational technologist. So what he does is he's a trained language instructor or teacher who works on the front lines. He works in the trenches, but his job is to pair technology that's suitable for educational purposes and do teacher training based on that. That's his full-time job. We don't have positions like that in Japan, for starters, nationally. And so what you have is this great divide where you have these tech centers or media, what they call media centers in some places, and then you have teacher demands, and never shall the twain meet. I mean, you can voice all you want to do, but in the end, you have people in some back office who have no concept of what's going on for teaching or how to achieve those learning objectives, making the decisions about technology, the very tools that it would be like deciding for a brain surgeon, like administrators to decide for a brain surgeon what tools they need to do their job, for example. I know it's an exaggerate, I'm kind of being hyperbolic here, but you get my point.
That's a good point. There's just something that I want to say, like to add on to that, is that so like in Japan, there seems to be like, I don't know, like a hesitancy or like a resistance to online learning. And it kind of,
yes.
I mean, right from the administration, but why should we be surprised that the administration is not doing enough or not being prepared enough? I mean, the students, themselves kind of follow that. Maybe there's just this huge cultural divide that they don't value online learning. In fact, when I surveyed students, they almost found that, when teachers use too much online learning as being, negligent, like they weren't teaching properly. Like a teacher should, lead a traditional, teacher-led classroom. And, I mean, again, like I'm being too,
talk.
like I'm generalizing too much, you know what I mean? But
No, not at all.
No,
I think this is, I've been doing online learning since the late 90s. I used to work for Sony Corporation. And this has been a consistent problem for decades, where as a society, Japan is incredibly technologically advanced compared to other countries. But this one particular area of using technology for education, there's just this very high level of resistance. And I think this may be one of the few silver linings of this past year, is that teachers, students, and and government officials are realizing that they've got to put their money where their mouth is. This is something that has to be addressed and has to be done.
Yeah, if I may add, what Charles said about Japan being technological, and then there's none of that where we are at, and just the idea, even if you go to the city hall and all that, everything's on paper, right? So foreigners who don't live in Japan, they are shocked when they first come, because they never thought Japan would have so much paper. That's one thing that we see all the time. I had a point that I wanted to share and it just slipped my mind. I'll get back to it when it comes back.
Actually, yeah, I really hate to break up this discussion because I think it's a critical discussion, but at the same time, yes, Tila is ready to present next. We have 5 minutes. Her presentation is starting at 16:10, and she'll be talking about using gestures in verbal systems acquisition towards an embodied language learning.
Hey, Pino, thank you for opening up a can of worms.
Yeah, that was
Wow.
great presentation.
Yeah,
Great presentation.
absolutely fabulous. Yeah, if I could add one thing, like the online learning, the problems we've just recently discussed, they also apply to communicative language teaching.
Absolutely, yes.
No?
Absolutely right.
There's a lot of students that think that teachers are not doing their job if they put them in groups and they ask
No,
them
how to teach well online is exactly the same as how to teach communicatively. I mean, the same basic principles. That's exactly right.
Yeah. The online learning, requires so much more, student responsibility, and you'll have the same problems like in your face-to-face classes when you give too much autonomy, to the students. Like in Japan, it's like they really expect the teacher to lead them through it. There's an expectation, someday, like as a project, I'm going to study, like this is like a different topic, but I'd like to study about, how to supervise, theses much better than I do. Because when it comes to like time to it, they're not doing that online, but they have such a hard time because so much of it is independent work. I sometimes feel like my students just want me to write it for them. It just becomes really hard when they're doing things like that. And I think there just has to be a better way.
We should chat sometime,
but I have to find my way through that. That's another project.
Actually, I would direct you to the discussion room 2 for further discussion. At this point in time, though, I have to get Phyllis set up. So
and Pino, let's talk about this later because it's an issue that I dealt with and actually have some ideas about. But great presentation, and I'll be here to the very end, so maybe we can talk later.
Okay, I'd like that. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Great job.
Okay. Tila, when you're ready, I'm gonna pin you to the main screen. And